So automating your deployments within to Azure is a really good way of doing that, but there can be a lot of choice in toolsets and languages, and it can be often hard choosing which one. So what I always tell my customers is to choose something that you're already prolific in. So if you have PowerShell wizards within your organizations, start with that toolset and then grow from there. And maybe in 6 or 12 months' times, evaluate that. Because you've used it, you'll understand what you want and what you don't want from that toolset, and then you can go forward from there.
Hey everybody, it's your buddy Jay. I am here broadcasting live from Brooklyn, New York, and welcome back to Azure FunBytes. Well, what do we do every week? We get together, we talk about the products, services, and the people that make up an amazing Azure experience. So this time I'm going to be having a great guest that's going to be talking to me about something that we touched on last week, and I think that you'll really appreciate a little bit more expansion into what exactly we talked about last time. So last time we talked about Bicep, and Bicep's kind of a new way of presenting and creating Azure Resource Manager templates. But Azure Resource Manager templates are still extremely relevant. And to be honest with you, Bicep just converts things into those templates. So what we're going to want to do is just take a deeper look into it. We'll talk with Shannon. We'll get to understand everything that we can in this short amount of time about them. But enough talking by me. Why don't we bring Shannon in? Hey, Shannon, how are you today?
I'm well, Jay. How are you?
Great. So, Shannon Keene, I'm so glad that you are here. It is great to have you part of the show. I've admired your work for a while, and I know we get chances to kind of talk here and there, but we don't really get a lot of opportunities to do these types of things together.
It's true. So I appreciate the invitation for sure, because I think it's hard. We get so stuck in our ways, and we're just working, trying to do all different types of things to get content out there, and we often forget that we should probably go and talk to our teams every so often and figure out how we could help each other. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity.
I'm really a big fan of collaboration. I think collaborating to build whatever it is you're going to do, whether it's in a team to build something sort of software or infrastructure, or building a show like this. I love to have people involved. I like making sure that, I'm not the only one getting the attention and also the only one that's looking at something.
Right.
It's great to have another pair of eyes on a thing that you're trying to build and create. And I think that that's a good kind of segue into what we're going to be talking about, because this can be a collaborative effort of building these templates if you need to. But before we get into that, Shannon, I got questions for you.
Okay.
I got some stuff for you.
Sounds
Before
good.
we do that, I want to remind everybody, one, that we're taking a poll. It's a leftover from last week's poll. And I'd like you to, if you can, answer it. Are you currently implementing infrastructure as code for your deployments? Head over to LearnTV, aka.ms LearnTV, and you'll also find on the right rail all the docs for today. They'll be in the blog post that you can catch after the fact. They'll be in the YouTube comments, or I should say YouTube description. You'll be able to find everything you need. And the other thing I want to remind you of is that's super important is that Microsoft Learn is a really great place for you to kind of start getting your feet wet with a lot of this types of stuff. So rather than just hearing about it or reading documentation about it, you can actually start working with it. And so one of the other great modules on Microsoft Learn I really like is the introduction to Azure Fundamentals. There'll be a link for today's deploy and manage resources in Azure by using JSON ARM templates. So you'll be able to get to that. All really great stuff. But I want to get back to you, Shannon. We've given everybody the intro, the things that we want them to do. But first and foremost, you've had kind of a non-traditional background, which is something that I always love to hear about, the way people got here. And so
Sure.
I want to ask you, before we kind of start getting into the tech, how did you get here?
So in a really weird roundabout way, I fell into tech by way of being a DJ. So I never went to school for computer science. I went to school for communication studies and English. And then it gravitated toward, I fell in love with, all different types of music. One of my big passions is electronic music. And I had to figure out how to connect all of my DJ gear to a computer. And somebody without that background was a little bit of a mixed bag for me. I was able to troubleshoot, I was able to figure it out. And the guiding principle was I wanted to be able to go and play at a club. So I had to get a club promoter my demo. And it just started from there. I found myself in roles where nobody knew how to fix a printer. Nobody knew how to fix a BlackBerry. I started kind of picking up those skills. And then I found myself at a job where it was a real estate investment firm, smaller, and there was no IT person. And they really liked the fact that I was able to troubleshoot and figure things out. And they started investing in my education on top of the fact they started working with more and more consultants that had specialized in Microsoft technologies, right? So I became really, really good with Exchange and Office 365 and Active Directory and VMware. I kind of moved out of that role because I kind of sort of outgrew it at some point and found my way into Azure outright 100%. Almost 5 years ago, I got hired on by a Microsoft partner. And so It was interesting to take my background, very heavy in infrastructure, right? Racking, stacking, GUI-driven deployments, wizard-driven deployments, and kind of taking myself into Azure outright, where you're hitting REST APIs more directly. And I don't know, if you would have approached me 10 years ago and said that people would be trusting the cloud, that more and more companies would be looking towards the cloud, and that I would be somewhere sitting in between infrastructure and development, I probably would have called BS, right? Like, that's not going to happen. And here we are.
And so you were a program manager and a solution architect for a little bit before you came into the developer relations world.
Correct.
How do you feel like those types of roles got you prepared for what we're doing now?
Sure. So I started as a cloud solution architect, and the program management role was a short-lived 6-month function as part of the cloud solution architect org. So I was able to go sit and shadow the Azure Blob Storage team, and that was a super fun experience to see how engineering works. So a lot of it, though, has been very customer driven, right? How does a customer make use of cloud? And it's not always straightforward, and everybody learns so differently too. I don't know. I mean, I think you kind of get that, right? The mixed modality of Learn, that's one of the reasons I love the Learn modules, because of the fact it's reading, there's video, there's pictures, right? And you can actually go and deploy things into subscriptions that are sandbox subscriptions, and they're time boxed, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up your resources after the fact, right? So there's a number of different ways to learn, and I always like to demystify things for customers. And so then it turned into finding an open opportunity inside of advocacy, where I was able to kind of be that champion of different Azure services. And I spent a lot of time talking about Azure VMware Solution, but I love Azure outright. I think there's really no ceiling when you think about cloud and what cloud can offer. So
that sounds great. You know, I love hearing these stories. They're really important to me because I think that they set context on why I want to talk to you, because it gives us some understanding of where you've been, and other people can get to this, to do these types of things as well. This isn't something that's, magical that only a few people get to be part of as far as technology is concerned. It's a really, really open environment for people to kind of use the skills that they might have had from previous work, previous experience, and to incorporate that into the work that they may want to do in technology, whether it's writing code, building infrastructure, or even doing things like we do and advocating for the cloud.
Right. Yeah. So I love being at Microsoft too, right? Like, I think we can say that, right?
Yeah. I can agree with you. I feel like being at Microsoft has been kind of a highlight of my career. We're given so many resources to work with in order to actually accomplish our goals. And we're all very goal driven. It's an organization that makes you kind of think about what it is you want to accomplish.
Right.
And I think that that's really a big part of developer relations. Jeff Sandquist and the people, Patrick, they really look to us to kind of be that voice to people who might be just on the fringe of being able to start doing this stuff, that people who are invested in other parts of technology that want to start using the cloud, and people who just want to learn more. I feel like we're put in a really great position in our developer relations department.
Agreed.
So we've got a pretty big agenda today. You got plenty of stuff for us to talk about. And I wanted to kind of get started with the start. And so let's get a little bit of an introduction and then talk a little bit about the correlation to what we talked about. I should say I talked last week to Alex Frankel about, which was Bicep. So tell me a little bit about ARM and your understanding of it, and kind of what your definition is.
Sure. So when I first started in on cloud-based deployments, I started to hear this whole notion of declarative syntax. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me until I heard a great analogy, right? So if you think about, there's two different types of programming languages, right? There's imperative, and then there's declarative. So imperative is where you're given every single step that you have to take in the order that you have to take it. Whereas declarative is more so, I want an end state. I don't care how you get it there, but I need an end state. So the best analogy I can think of, and I often said this with customers, is maybe you'd ask your friend to draw you a picture of a landscape, right? You didn't care what the landscape looked like. You just wanted a landscape. Your friend's really talented as an artist. That would be like declarative syntax. Whereas imperative would be like Bob Ross instructing you on every little thing that you had to do to make all of those happy trees, right? And so declarative is the nature of where we want to go related to code, because it allows for idempotency, which is the way that you can actually continue to deploy the same type of state regardless of where that environment exists. So declarative allows for that, whereas something that's more imperative, you have to change a lot more things in order to continue to deploy it in multiple different environments. So that was kind of the big takeaway that I realized was cloud brings scale. We want to be able to build these environments in a uniform fashion, and we want to do it quickly. And so ARM templates became the de facto standard, and I think I started embracing it back in 2016, 2017, and I have learned a ton just trying to absorb how to make something happen, right? Because I could kind of always picture what I wanted, but until somebody starts to break apart what you're doing, and you start to kind of read more and understand what you're doing, and there's a lot of trial and error involved too, right? Even
Sure.
with Bicep, right? So you have to just be comfortable with the red text of death and realize that you get better each time you go through it. So it's just like practicing anything, I think.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with Ruby building stuff in Chef for years. And so I remember that kind of red text of death that really just took up a ton of my time. But I wanted, you brought up something, and I really like this picture. I think it really helps explain what's going on, is that people, and excuse the expletive there, didn't mean to get that in there. But the idea that a lot of times people will just give you an instruction, but not necessarily tell you how to accomplish all those goals, especially in DevOps. It tends to be, hey, build a pipeline for that. But you ask yourself, well, how exactly does that pipeline come together? And so I find it really interesting that ARM templates, Bicep, they kind of help you fill in how to draw the owl.
Yeah, agreed. And it gives you flexibility too. And the way I understand it, and now I'm not a developer, I joke a lot that I just play one on TV. I've had customers think I've been a developer my entire career because my vernacular has changed over the course of my tech career. But I just, I know developer terms, and I think that's the direction every developer wants to go toward, right? Declarative code, it's easier to read, easier to understand. Whereas in imperative code, while it's good for beginners, you eventually want to advance and get yourself to a better frame of mind. And they both accomplish the same thing. So I don't want anybody to feel like they're struggling. Like I get PowerShell. I don't want to go and learn something new. Perfectly fine. You're going to achieve the same end state. You're just going to have more work to get that same end state in multiple environments. I think that's where declarative becomes a better kind of transition point for customers that are trying to figure out how to, build out these deployments programmatically.
And in your agenda, you bring up something that's really interesting that I think tends to be one of the biggest selling factors of doing things in infrastructure as code, and that's item potency.
Yep.
And being able to repeat. You want to talk to people a little bit about what that means as far as item potency with cloud scale and in regards to deployments of infrastructure?
Yeah, I think so it takes too long for manual configurations, right? I think we can all agree upon that. And there's better ways to think about configuration management. There's better ways to think about provisioning infrastructure. So item potency allows you to take a template or maybe a series of templates and plug it into any environment and have the same deployment in any one of those environments. So I often think of item potency as a great tool or a great concept when you have multiple different types of environments. So you've got production, you've got dev, you've got test. You probably need to do all of your testing before it reaches production. So item potency based templates allow for that. And you're able to not necessarily, think about manual configurations. You know that the environment you deploy, dev, test, stage, will be the same for production. Maybe you change minimal things, right? Like the VM name or the public DNS name, right? But that's pretty straightforward. It's going to be the same environment minus a handful of things that are easy to change and change quickly.
And what's great is that everything that you need can be defined within your actual infrastructure as code. If you need a network, you can build that network within the same template as the rest of your infrastructure. So maybe you need to create an AKS cluster or some virtual machines, and you need that VNet to actually interconnect everything. You can specify all that. You can have outputs, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes up an ARM template in just a minute. But let's kind of get started with the start. And how do you get started exactly? Like, how do you get started using these templates?
Sure. So there's a couple of different documents that I like to reference often. We've got a couple of them that I think are decent to understand the format. So if you're looking at my screen, and we are, so this is the basic format. You've got your schema, and this is essentially what tells the ARM APIs how to programmatically deploy this file, right? And it's just sort of like I don't know if I'd call it the brains of the operation, because it's just sort of like maybe like the way in which to handle reading all of the different components of the file. The content version, that is something where, let's say you had a number of different environments, you could number those different environments. So it's a required field. A lot of times in our examples, you'll see 1.0.0.0. I think you do need 4 digits. I haven't played with it recently though, but I do think you need something like 4 digits there. So schema is required, content version is required. API profile might be something if everything you're deploying has to have the same API, you could have that referenceable at a higher up level. So this would all become before your resource declaration at the bottom. You've got parameters. So those are the things that would change, right? The VM name, the public DNS name, right? Things like that would change regularly. And then your variables don't change as often. So sometimes you'll concatenate things, right? You'll concatenate a storage account name and add a resource GUID on the end. So it's always unique and different each time. You can think about building out functions, right? So naming prefixes, if you wanted to have everything have the same naming prefix, you could build out these functions. And then the actual resources, right? So if you were to look at the pieces here, so schema is required, content versions required, as well as resources. Nothing else is required, but I tell you what, the parameters, variables, and even outputs are probably what I lean on the most. Outputs are more so things like, let's say you needed to know what that public IP was for something you deployed, and you don't want to have to go log into the portal. It's one extra step you have to take. Wouldn't it be easier to code that so that when it goes through the deployment process, you'll get an IP address at the end of that deployment? So those are great ways just to understand the template kind of structure. And then, we've got a lot of best practices. So as you become more familiar with how to build this out, you'll want to make sure that you don't have anything over 256 parameters, right? It's a very big template, but these are limits that you're going to want to know. And this is another great resource to go to. There's some great recommendations for parameters, security recommendations for parameters. So if you're passing a password, you want to make sure it's a secure string.
Sure. And I guess you're wanting to lean on things like Key Vault.
Correct.
To be able to store those credentials or secrets so that you're not passing them over in clear text.
Correct. And referencing that inside of an ARM template, I actually posted a blog post recently about that. It's a little awkward, and it took me a bit to understand it, but I often evangelize the idea of finding a developer friend that can teach you how this actually works. Because so in my blog post, I talk about the fact that I would go to the quick start repo and I would try and figure out exactly how to build something out. And you'd always see Gen Unique. And I guess you have to kind of dig to find that out. They didn't want to put a secret in there, but there's also no great examples that I could find. And I just struggled. And I worked with a CSA colleague of mine on my last team, and he helped me out kind of to figure it. So that was something I wanted to get out there, just because I think it's a hard reality for folks to kind of know how to plug some of this in. But the quick start repo, let me see, I should make this a little bit bigger. It has changed ever so slightly. So I feel like there's better organization, where it used to just be a bunch of different templates. So you had 101 templates, 201, 301, and then a bunch of different more complex. So you'll go here to the quick starts, and we've now organized it based upon resource provider. So everything that gets deployed inside of Azure has a resource provider. So a VM has a resource provider. A NIC for your VM has a resource provider. So every resource that gets provisioned has a resource provider. And, you'll start to become more familiar with what you're leaning on. So I think a lot of sysadmins that are moving into more of a software-defined world, they're probably going to hang out in Microsoft Compute quite a bit. And here's a bunch of different examples. So if you wanted, one VM with a load balancer and 2 NICs, hey, great, here's an awesome example that you could deploy from, right? There's a great README. You could literally just click on deploy to Azure, and it could start that process for you. You obviously knowing the code is helpful, but if you're just trying to get a feel for how this works, you could skip this and start with deploy to Azure and see how far you get.
Yeah, the deploy to Azure button kind of takes all the guesswork out of it, brings you right over to the portal and says, okay, fill in the parameters.
Yes, exactly.
But
so let's see if we could even try it here.
Sure.
Let's see how I'll log in. I've got a couple of different accounts that I'm working on right now for content that we're building, but it'll take you here. Let's see, is this a little bit bigger here? You'll pull your subscription over. You could go to an existing resource group or create a brand new resource group. You pick whatever region you needed to deploy it in. You need an admin password, an admin username. You need a DNS name for the load balancer IP. And then you literally just hit review and create. And in theory, it spins up, right? So I think a lot of folks, so I can get back to where I was. Of course not. There we go. Went back far enough. Oh, well, I'll have to get to it. But the idea here is, let's see. We can get back. Azure Quick Start. And here again. There we go. So we're back in here. The idea of all of the quick starts now have that functionality, as well as I do believe I've even seen a number of Bicep files in here too. So I don't know, and I haven't looked at all of them. So this one doesn't have a Bicep file in here, but we're starting to see Bicep contribution inside the quick starts as well. So yeah. It's a nice thing just to factor in.
And there's a really great Bicep Playground, and that I talked a little bit last week with Alex about. I'll bring it up just for a second, just so you can see that there's a clear difference between the two. As far as this is this is an ARM template. On the left, this is the Bicep Playground. Now, what's really great is you go up here to sample templates, you can actually take a look at all these. You can go to, say, one of them, and you can look at the kind of difference between the two. Once the Bicep has been decompiled, if you will, into a ARM template. But ARM templates are really kind of the base of all of this with Bicep. Like, Bicep is just a language that kind of writes ARM templates. And so these quick starts, they give you kind of a map, a plan, a way to kind of get started, that you can take these, you can manipulate them. And that's one of the beauties of using ARM templates or Bicep or any infrastructure as code, is the repeatability and reusability of the stuff that you've built. So if you've already spent the time to write out an entire piece of code for a deployment, and you say, you know what, I've got to build a development environment, I can just go ahead and reutilize this. And we'll talk a little bit about parameters files in a second, and how you can actually pass parameters for different environments in just a moment. But I want to remind everybody, just real quick, Shannon, just to give you a break, I want to remind everybody, please head over to LearnTV. That's aka.ms/LearnTV. We're asking today, are you currently implementing infrastructure as code for your deployments? We want to know. Go ahead, take that poll right now. And as a reminder, you can go to the right rail. You can get all the docs for today's show. And if you want to go ahead and send some questions, we would love to hear what you have to ask. We want to make sure that you're involved. We want to make sure that you are part of this show. So feel free to use your native chat within whatever way you're using. If you're using Twitter, you're using YouTube, you name it. Twitch, send in, or you can go over to LearnTV and you can use the ask your question box on the right. So Shannon, we got a lot more of our agenda to go through. We've got about maybe 40 minutes. No, we've got less than 35 minutes to go. And so one of the things I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about is how you can utilize these with VS Code or Visual Studio.
Yeah, so I think, let's see, what I'll do here is I'll start with Visual Studio, because for me, that's the direction I went. So I'll create a new project, and hopefully you can see this. Fortunately, I don't think I can actually make this any bigger, but you have these templates that are part of Visual Studio, and the engineering inside Visual Studio kind of will help you out if you're brand new to Azure. All you've got to do is click on Azure Resource Group, click on Next. I'll title this ARM Template Demo, and it'll place it here. You can always place it somewhere else, right? And then it's going to give you a solution name, and that's the file that contains everything Visual Studio needs to know exactly what to give you when this environment spins up. So you hit create. Oh, I have that name. I'll call it Azure or ARM Template Demo 1. How about that? There we go. And what you see at the top here is some interesting engineering. So you can obviously pick a blank template. In fact, I'm going to for what I'll go through. But notice how you've got the Azure Quick Start repo linkable here.
Oh. So you don't even have to go to the GitHub repo.
You can want to. Correct. And I think it's most of them. And you can always filter at the top. So Windows, let's try that. That's going to take a little bit of time here. But you'll get everything that's got Windows in it. So Web App Basic Windows, Web App VM DSC, right? And DSC is desired state configuration. So when you get to that point, ARM templates can be plugged in. Right. So if you're familiar with how to code that up with your environment, there's flexibility of doing that with an ARM template. So, but I'm going to actually pick a blank template.
Gotcha.
So let's go to the blank template.
And within here are all these different resources that you can use. Correct. Of course, you said a resource group. And then if we need a VM and we need to reference the resource group, we can do all that within ARM.
Correct. Yeah, so I started with Visual Studio. I liked the fact that it was linked to the quick starts. I don't know if this will evolve over time. I'm not on that team, but I do like some of the engineering that shows up here. I took a course on Pluralsight, and I'll give you that link. It's, do I have it open? I might have it open. Give me a second here. I do. So I took this class, and it's older. It was published, I think, in 2017, but it was a really good start. And this is, so what's the gentleman's name again? I can't remember his name. James Bannon. He actually uses Visual Studio in the way I'm going to show you how to use it. And it like blew my mind up. I didn't realize it was as simple as literally right-clicking on a resource. So let's add a new resource. Let's say we want to pick a virtual network. Virtual network. Here we go. We'll call this ARM template VNet. We'll hit add. Look at what just popped up. We've got a handful of variables, a resource. I didn't have to code any of that. So I started looking at this going, oh my, this makes this so much easier, right? And so everything gets populated. Now, granted, I think the thing to call out here, though, too, is you're using a little older APIs, which is not a terrible thing. There's a couple of ways to take a look at the newer APIs. So this script right here, hopefully you can see it, the Get AZ Resource Provider. And I'm looking at the Microsoft.compute resource provider because I'm looking at, let's say I'm looking at the VMs, right? Where the object is equal to a virtual machine. What are the API versions? You could literally run this, and I am authenticated. I was able to get it to work. I don't know why it didn't work earlier. So thank you, demo gods, for being kind. You'll get a readout of all the different APIs. And I think the thing to call out is, using Visual Studio like I'm showing is great to get started. But down the road, you may want to use a newer Azure service. Let's say you want to use Private Link. It requires a newer API. So that would be something to dig into. You can run this script. You can get the API that you need. And that's all referenceable in the documentation. And let me do this as well. There's another link. I want to say it is.
While you're doing that, I just want to show everybody something really quick. I think that it's so while we're looking at this stuff in Visual Studio, there's also support for Visual Studio Code, and there are great extensions as always. You can use the Azure Resource Manager ARM tools. It'll help you with different snippets for the templates, and getting started is just as simple as creating a new file and calling it something.json. We can go ahead and go ARM and then start using this to actually define what it is we want to build.
Yeah, you can add, I think it's like ARM-VM. It'll give you the VM, the NIC, and I believe it will give you the network as well. So you get a lot of code like kind of just given to you by way of spinning some of that up. So I'll flip back here to the demo real quick.
Great.
And so right now I've got everything kind of in the variable format and then the resource. So let me save this. The one thing that I do need to grab is the deployment script. So this is the one thing that's a little hard too. The deployment script that shows up when you build this out inside of Visual Studio, it's using Azure RM. I'm not using that anymore. I don't think a lot of people are. So I'm going to quickly adjust it with a script that I have. It shows up in our documentation. It's a gist on or a gist. Is it a gist or is it a gist? I don't know. I don't never know what.
I call them gist.
Gist. Okay, cool. So it's a gist on GitHub and it's an updated. And so really all it's doing is it's for the most part just changing it to AZ versus Azure RM. So this template's here. I'm not going to change it. You can deploy it. You can create a brand new deployment. Let's I got to tie it to a different account here.
And of course, just about everything is based on subscriptions, based on the actual directory that you're in.
Correct. Let's create a brand new resource group. Let's put it in East US.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, right. I deploy a lot in East US, and I have North Central down the street. I probably should be kinder to the region that's in close proximity. But the one thing I wanted to call out here is if you had parameters, you could actually fill it in here. And so I think the next piece I'll go through is I'll add a VM to this VNet, and I'll show you how some of those parameters show up. But remember, it's all variables. So I'll just hit deploy, and we will watch the verbose pieces here. It's going through its template check. The template's valid. Let me flip over here. So let me refresh. We've got ARM template demo 1. Now it won't show up. There's always a little bit of a delay. So I'll flip back here and we'll watch this spit out a status update. It successfully deployed the template, right? That's always helpful. I've got a simplified version of this that'll showcase. It's a very straightforward thing. Like the new AZ resource deployment, you provide the let's see, I think I've got it here. You supply the deployment file, the parameters file if you need it, and then it's literally this part of the script, right? You're giving a name, right, of the resource group deployment, right? You're providing the resource group, the template file, the parameters file, and then you're asking for the verbose flag. That verbose flag is helpful. And I just don't know the AZ CLI equivalent. I spend too much time in PowerShell. So I'm assuming there's something in the realm of AZ CLI, but that's one of the things that's always kind of on the back burner. I've got to get better with the AZ CLI because I know it's sometimes a faster lift if you're trying to figure out how to code some of your stuff.
Yeah, and it's got a really good set of tools for creating things for resource groups and doing deployments. I definitely recommend taking a look. You can install the Azure CLI using that URL. And I just wanted to show everybody something really quick, give you a sec to kind of get ready for your next part.
Sure.
So one of the things that that's really great about once you create some of these resources is that you can export them right out of the Azure portal if you need to, so that you can duplicate your work. Like I said, you might just create a bunch of resources in the portal and then want to be able to generate a template and export that so that you can maybe make some modifications to the parameters, make some changes to the variables. So what happens is that the Azure portal will go ahead, it will export everything that you've created into an ARM template and allow you to kind of run through it and create new resources.
Yeah, and you used to have to refactor a lot more. The export functionality has definitely gone through a couple levels of graduation, right? It was always something that I always spent so much time refactoring it, and now I'm spending a lot less time refactoring. So they are plugging in variables, and there's parameters being plugged in, and it's programmatically trying to figure out what would go where. But it's an awesome spot if you're just trying to figure out how do I make sense of this ARM template. It's awesome. So I used to have customers who would go build out their entire environment inside of one resource group, then export the template, and then their folks would become more savvy with ARM templates that way, and they take that ARM template and go deploy it to dev, test, stage, and then eventually production. So it's a great way to get more of a feel of how an ARM template works.
So Shannon, before you go into the next part of the demo, I've got a question from a viewer.
Sure.
And it comes from Call of Duty, who asks, are these templates reusable? And before applying changes in template, can we see after effects? So I guess, is there a way to do like a dry run of the actual template before you actually execute?
Yeah, you can. So let me see if I can find it in this script here. There is a test command. So
and that's another really great part about this is the fact also you can write tests. You can write tests to make sure that what you expect to come up does come up.
Correct. Now let's see if I can find it. That's always the thing, right? Like I know it exists in this larger block of text, but I can't quite remember exactly. I guess I could do Control F test. Where's test? Test path. That's not what I want. This is for if you had DSC files, right? So let's see. Yep, here we go. So you're validating. So you're testing the AZ resource group deployment. You're providing the resource group name, and that's a variable that gets stored, the template file, the template parameters file, and it will tell you if it cannot work. So if you remember, let me pull this back up here.
It looks like there's a module, and I'll bring it up really quick. Well,
Yeah,
the ARM template deployment what if operation. And so it looks like you can install Azure CLI or PowerShell, and you can actually create some what if commands.
Right.
So I think you can see here like AZ deployment group what if. I think you can also use this confirm with what if. What's going to happen when you do that deployment?
Right. And I think that's awesome. I don't know if you saw this. So right here, it gave me the verbose flag that the template is valid. So it went through and it tested the deployment. It didn't see any issues with the way in which that, I added the resource in and now all that, the file then populated. It saw no issue with it. And it gave me, I guess, the idea that it should be able to move forward. And as you see here, I had literally a couple of seconds later, I get it's successfully deployed. So that verbose flag is what's helpful when you're actually deploying. The test or the what if, those are great ways to figure out if you're using your, or if you formatted everything correctly, meaning you've got your parameters file and all your parameters filled in. And I've had this happen where you've got a parameter that's not actually used in the file. I think sometimes it'll fail. So it helps you trying to figure out, do you have everything accounted for that the ARM APIs are going to be looking for, especially the API version that you're calling in the template.
Great. So you've mentioned a parameters file a couple times. And I'd love you to kind of show me how that works in relationship to the actual template that we're building.
Sure. So let's do this. So I was going to add another resource. So let me add,
go. Why don't do that first if you want to.
Yeah, let me add a virtual machine here. Now, granted, it's going to be an older API, but that's perfectly fine. It still works. So, and then we need to give it a storage account. Now, this is actually going to create a non-managed disk, but that's not what you want. But refactoring it's not painful. The reference that we showcased earlier, the ARM template reference, that'll show you how to formulate an actual managed disk as the disk object inside of the resource. So we'll call this store account, add it in. Let's see, we will put it in this subnet. So this is why, so when I was trying to figure out how to do deployments to existing VMs, I actually used this because I struggled to make it work. And what this does is it will spit out a subnet reference, and that's how the ARM APIs know where to place this VM.
Sure. So we want to make sure we're in the right network within this VNet that we create.
Correct. So we'll add this in, and notice that we now have a bunch of parameters. And then let me also add in a public IP. So I don't have site-to-site connectivity. So I'm doing a very bad thing. You don't want to do this in production, but if you're learning, perfectly fine, especially if you're going to destroy it after you just make sure it works. So we'll call it ARM template pip. And we're tying it to the existing VM NIC that's now declared in the template. And it's added. And look at all the code that got just created. This was so helpful for me when I was trying to figure out, how does this work? I want to add this VM to the actual subnet or the VNet that exists. And let me go in here real quick.
Yeah, having all those predefined snippets really helps you.
Oh, totally.
Learn what you're doing.
Yeah. So what I had found was a lot of people would, start with a single VNet like this, right? And that's deployed, and it's got the subnets accounted for. They're not, named very well, but whatever. It's up. It's functional. I didn't have to do too much, right? And then this is now going to go into the same subnet. So let's go and take a look at this here. So there's the VM subnet reference. So VM, the network ID. So first things first, it's going, the resource ID, this is the ARM template VNet that I just created. And the subnet ref is concatenating the ARM template VNet ID from the variable up above. It's plugging in the subnet because I tied it to that subnet, and it's tying it to that first subnet name. So that then shows up in the VM object inside the network profile, I think, right? Let's see, hang on, or is it? It does show up because it needs to know where to place it.
Sure.
These things. I think I do believe it's going to be, oh no, so it's going to be in the network. So the NIC gets attached to the VM. There's a subnet ID declaration here. And
you attach that subnet to the NIC.
Correct. Correct.
So it's like if you were actually pre-configuring a network card with an IP address on it, or at least knowing where to get that IP address and just shoving it into the a virtual computer and just saying, hey, this network card is associated with 1001/16. Let's pop that in.
Correct. Yeah. And so, like I said, I had trouble with some of the quick starts and some of the Visual Studio snippets. And so when I was trying to figure this out a while back, literally, it wasn't like it was a recent thing. I went into Visual Studio and then added a NIC and tied it to an existing VNet. And that's how I figured out how the ARM APIs are really looking for where that NIC goes. So I'll save this. And I want to showcase, so, we've got the VM name, the VM admin username, VM admin password, right? So nothing's been populated in the parameters file just yet. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You can actually, so notice how I'm going back to the same deployment. Everything's idempotent, right? You can go in here and you can edit what you're looking for. So you can call this ARM template VM. My initials are SBK, so SBK admin is something I use often. I'll give it a password. And then, so it is picking older servers, which is not the end of the world, but you can always change that as well. These are allowed, what are called allowed values. So as you build out ARM templates, you can control what you want folks to deploy by adding in certain things like allowed values. You can provide a default value. If your template is more often than not going to be, Windows based, you could have that be your default, but you could always change it to one of the allowed values as well. So let's see, I'll call this ARM template. ARM template DNS. Now I'm going to do this because I don't have Key Vault configured, and this is just easier for the purpose of showcasing this. In a real true scenario, you would use my blog post as like a guide to showcase how you would call this. It would show up in the parameters file, but I'm just going to save it as a plain text. And this is going to be, this environment will be gone almost instantaneously as soon as it's provisioned. So I will save that and look at what showed up here all of a sudden, right? I won't highlight the password, but you've got like the ARM template, you've got my name, you've got, the ARM template DNS. In fact, actually, maybe what I'll do here too is I will just change this password to something. I will save that, and it should. Okay, there we go. Perfect. That's what I should have done to begin with. So
I like that little da-da-da.
Yeah, did you like that?
Yeah, it's great. And just so you know, Shannon, we got about less than 10 minutes left. And so I just want to keep you aware of time.
Sure. So let's do this. So I can showcase the parameters, and then we can try deploying this, and it should just deploy.
Sure.
And I haven't refactored too much, but I always stress that if you're just building that muscle, right, you're trying to figure out how this works, this is a fantastic tool. It's, like I said, it's got a little older engineering, so it's using the older APIs, and it's going to deploy a VM that doesn't have a managed disk, but switching that out and taking examples from some of the documentation that we've shared, as well as some of the ARM snippets inside of Visual Studio Code. I like Visual Studio because it kind of got me started. Visual Studio Code I've transitioned into, but I was thinking about this, the idea of deploying. So we've deployed the VNet. Now we're getting ready to deploy the VM in the same VNet. I like the idea that you can do that, and it's not going to deploy another virtual network as well, right? It's going to go through here. It's going to figure out what's been deployed. So let's click the deploy button. We'll wait here. Template's valid. It's going to go through everything. So notice how the VNet was a very quick check. It's already showing up as succeeded. If we flip over here to the portal and start hitting refresh, oh, maybe it takes a little bit longer. But once you'll start, so the storage account got provisioned. Public IP address is there. Everything's there. It's like things are starting to build. So
Lost you for a second.
Oh no. Let's see.
Looks like your camera kind of took a dive there.
It did. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. What's the easiest to do? Is stop my cam and restart it? Oh, hang on.
Give that a shot.
I see it. Hang on. Let's try that.
And hey, while she's fixing her camera, let's take a second to remind you all we can go ahead and hit that poll. There's a poll. We've got like less than 10 minutes left, and we'll definitely want to know what you're thinking, what you're doing. Are you using infrastructure as code for your deployments? If so, please take part in the poll. Anyhow, Shannon, let me bring this back up for you.
So it looks like we've got the public IP, the NIC, we've got the storage account. And so we can flip back here to, so yeah, the VM's provisioning. And I like the verbose flag because it kind of gives you an idea. Like, so if you just step away for a bit, and let's say something fails, right? The VM can't build, the public IP can't come online, right? It will tell you where it failed and why. And then you can start piecing it together by way of the activity log. So the activity log will always give you that raw JSON. And that raw JSON inside the portal will highlight exactly what didn't work. And you can start digging in and taking a look at this. But this is successful. And remember, I'm not adjusting this too much. I literally took the code that exists for the most part inside adding a resource, adding certain components. And this environment now should be live and fully functional. And so we've got this VM. Now, granted, I'm doing very, very, things you wouldn't do in production, right? I put a public IP on a VM. You don't want to do that in production. But if you're trying to get familiar with this, spinning it up like very quickly, it's a really easy reality. And then you can grab the RDP file, and then we can take a look at this. Oh, it's gonna hang on. I'll connect here, and I'll move it.
While you're doing that, just want to show everybody what's great. Like I said, you can do a lot of this stuff in Visual Studio Code. So I just created this quick ARM template, and then if I go over here to resources, I can just start typing ARM, and it'll give all those same types of snippets that we saw in Visual Studio here in VS Code. So if I want to create, say, a VM, there you go. Now we've got all this ARM code, and we can actually even pass a custom script. So if we have that in the same variable, I should say same directory, we pass it through when we actually do our deployment. It just allows us to actually build. So that with some pre-configured software or some sys prep that you might need to do.
Right. Adding a server role, configuring minimal IIS components, right? Like, there's a lot of ways to experiment with this, and I think
like DSC things like that.
Right, and if you think about ARM templates, right, what I have built today is a very generic template, but you can have it be as sophisticated and as robust as you want. There's a concept of having linked templates, right? Concept of having nested templates. You can run any sort of extension that might make sense. You can run a custom script extension. You can install those server roles, the DSC extension. You can do programmatic things like join a domain, format a disk, install certain services, roles, whatever you need. And that can happen at build time. And then it's up to your configuration management tooling to keep that configuration and make sure that it doesn't drift. So, so very bare bones, I have a VM in the VNet. Now, granted, I'm accessing it via public IP, so this is, something that we wouldn't want to do with production. But if you're just trying to become more familiar with it, like I said, my journey started with Visual Studio Code. I liked the fact that I could go into here and add resources, and a bunch of stuff would just trickle on through. That same engineering shows up in Visual Studio Code. You do have to refactor things, right? So I don't want to say that it's going to magically work. And then I wanted to also show this too. So remember, we already deployed the VNet. It didn't deploy a second VNet, right? What it did was it added on the extra pieces in that template that I asked it to provision. It said, oh yeah, the VNet's already here. It's going to have a successful readout. And then everything else wound up showing up on top. So that showcases the power of repeatability, I think. And then incremental builds. So if you've got a pretty large network, and let's say you're building a number of VMs, you could just tie those NICs to whatever subnet they need to, and then add a little bit of flavor in the ARM template, indicating that the VM build relies upon the NICs. Everything in theory would just come online. So there's a lot of flexibility and power in ARM templates. And sometimes I feel like, I think unless you've spent a lot of time with it, it's a little hard to grasp it. And it was hard for me to grasp it too. So I have, like I said, partner up with your dev friends. If something doesn't make sense, you're getting a weird error, something doesn't make sense at all. And your dev friends, they love to talk about code. You can't get them to shut up,
JSON is far less daunting than, say, working with a programming language. And that will get you to being able to use something like Bicep, which acts as a programming language on top of your ARM template. So, Shannon, we're just about ready to wrap up. Do you have anything else you'd like to kind of show within like a minute?
Not really, because I think the last thing I was going to do is I was going to deploy a file share and connect to it, but I didn't know how. That's pretty straightforward. I was going to take one of the quick start templates here and just deploy it, right? And it's pretty straightforward.
And I'll bring up that Azure deploy that I had just up for a second.
Sure.
So that people can see like exactly the different ways. Let me bring that back up for a second. So if you have that, the actual JSON already configured and everything ready, and you're ready to deploy, there's a couple ways of doing it. But the first thing you'll want to do, whether it's using PowerShell or Azure CLI, you want to create a resource group, and then you'll want to go ahead and go here and do your deployment. And so you can basically just specify here as a variable, and then AZ deployment group create, the name of the actual deployment. So this is just a representative of what the deployment's named, the resource group that you're going to be using, and then that template file. So in your case, it's going to be that file share or the VM we're going to create.
Right.
But let's go ahead and let's start wrapping up. So everybody, we asked you if you're using infrastructure as code for your deployment, and 63% of you said yes. And so we'll give you a nice applause.
A round of applause.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what, Shannon, I really do appreciate you being part of the show today. It was great having a conversation with you about ARM templates. Before we go, what's the best way people can get in touch with you on the internet?
Sure. So my Twitter handle is situated in my little screen right here. So, no, it's right. It's backwards right there. Or LinkedIn. So it's really a matter of what makes the most sense. And then I also have my tech blog, right? And I'm blogging more, trying to get more content out there. My blog is not necessarily what I do on a regular basis in my job. It's just stuff that I think is invaluable to know that maybe somebody didn't know prior to. And it's more so my hobby versus, so a lot of the stuff I'll write for my job will show up on a tech community blog.
Great. So thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your week and an amazing weekend. Thank you so much, Shannon. So let's give everybody the great big wave goodbye.
Sounds good.
And I'm not going to be on next week. I get to take some time off, but I'll be back the week after that. So until then, I'll see you. Thanks for watching Azure FunBytes.
Bye, everyone.